My name's Andy, and if you've been following my channel, you know that I like to play guitar, and I like to sing. I'm a professor at Duke Kunshan University here in China. Kunshan is a city between Shanghai and Suzhou, and I've been here for about 10 years. I'm talking from my apartment in Kunshan. I have an apartment in Kunshan, and this is my guitar dojo. Maybe I'll make another video showing you around the guitar dojo, but the purpose of today's episode on my channel, as you know, I sometimes talk about books that I've read, and especially books about music. And recently, I got this book on Kindle called The Guitar in American Life by Tim Brookes, who is a British writer, but lives in America, or lived in America at the time he was writing. I think he was a correspondent for NPR, which is great in my book. I love NPR. And yeah, he's just a very clever writer with that dry British wit, which you will see come out in some of the quotes that I've selected. But if you are a guitar player and you love the acoustic guitar as I do, this is my Eastman E8OM, which I bought recently in the used guitar market here in China. You get great prices on used Eastman guitars because it's a guitar that's made in China, made in Beijing from the Eastman company. Fantastic guitars, already at a very reasonable price, and if you hunt them on the used market, you can find great values. This is my tuner, which I keep on the table at all times, and you know, they say, I think it was Paul Simon, I don't know if he was the original person who said this, but I remember him quoting it. He said, guitar players spend half their life tuning their guitars and the other half playing out of tune. And that is so true. You're just constantly tuning up your guitar to get that fine tone. And we really become obsessed about our guitars, especially, you know, as you develop the habit of playing every day, and then you inevitably want to acquire new guitars, and you have to learn about how they're made and what woods they're made out of. This one is, well, most good acoustic guitars have a spruce top. This one has a spruce top, and I believe rosewood back and sides. And this is an orchestral model OM. So you become interested in all these little details about what woods they're made out of and what the size is, and then what's the history behind the different styles of guitar. And again, I'm talking acoustic here. I feel like electric guitar is a whole nother ball game. It's kind of like, you know, it's like folk music versus heavy metal. It's just a different culture. But for acoustic guitar lovers, you really get into the woods. You want to understand the make and model of the guitar and the brand and how they're made. Are they made in a factory? Are they made handcrafted? And if so, what does that mean? Was there a luthier involved overseeing the process? So you really get fascinated, and you go down this rabbit hole. You do a deep dive into this rabbit hole, and I think you never quite emerge from that. You're just a changed person, and from then on, you're always going to be fascinated by guitars, how they're made, where the different styles came from, why different woods have different tones, and why some are better than others. And it's kind of like, you know, I would liken it to a connoisseur of fine wines or whiskeys. most of us are content to just get a cheap wine or a whiskey as long as it's decent and drinkable, and drink it up. But then when you get deep into wine or whiskey, you start trying to understand the different places of origin, the different grapes they're made out of, why some wines are superior to others. So it's very similar with guitars. And there's just something magical about strumming and picking a beautifully made guitar that's just irreplaceable. So, I'm always on a quest for understanding more about guitars, and when my financial situation permits, maybe adding another one to my collection. Although I'd say I still have a reasonable number compared to a lot of collectors out there. I think I have maybe a dozen in all acoustics, and then a very small number of electrics, because I'm not much of an electric player. By the way, if you're curious about my t-shirt, Howling Wolf, 1969 Ann Arbor Blues Festival. I happened to be born in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1969. So even though I obviously wouldn't have gone to this festival, at least wouldn't remember it, I do have a special affinity for this t-shirt. And Howlin' Wolf has always been one of my favorite blues artists. And the blues has always been one of my favorite genres of music. But that's another story. Just wanted to mention that. Back to guitars. So I think anybody who collects guitars or who is fascinated about how acoustic guitars are made will love this book by Tim Brookes, Guitar and American Life. He really takes you deep into the history and the culture of guitars, of the acoustic guitar. I suppose if there's a thesis in there, it's that the guitar emerged in the 20th century in the matrix of American culture and society. And it started out as a rather marginal instrument, and eventually became a very central instrument. So it took maybe a century or more from it to move from a fairly marginal place in the social, matrix of American music into a very central place. You can say that by the 1960s, the guitar had really come of age as the main instrument for the singer-songwriter. So it took a long time. So he tells this fascinating story. It's full of wonderful anecdotes and great storytelling. He has, as I said, he has a great sense of dry humor that he brings to the storytelling. That just makes it a fun read. He doesn't overwhelm you with facts and data. It's certainly not an academic book in any sense of the word, and yet quite well researched, I think. I think he did his homework, looking into the history of the guitar. There may be points of contention along the way. I don't know enough. I'm not enough of an expert in the history of guitars to say, well, he got this wrong, he got that wrong. But what I can say is that it's a really fun read, and you learn a tremendous amount about how guitars came of age, the different stages through which they developed as an instrument, the different tools and techniques and building blocks that were used to manufacture guitars, and then why they became eventually popular amongst different communities. So he mentions the advent of Hawaiian guitar as a real breakthrough in the 19th century, and then of course the blues and the black bluesmen of the American South coming out of slavery and that legacy, and developing a whole new sound on guitar, maybe somewhat independently of the Hawaiian guitar phenomenon, but kind of the same era, early 20th century. And then You might be able to hear an ambulance in the background. We have a hospital very nearby, which is always a good thing. And then how the guitar started out as a nylon string instrument. Well, actually, before that it was called catgut. It was like sheep intestine or something that was used to string the guitars. And then in the early 20th century, there was this revolution where they started using steel strings. They had to create a stronger body in order to hold the tension of the steel strings and really reconfigure the shape and the frame of the guitar to accommodate steel strings. That happened in the early 20th century. So all these technical revolutions happening alongside the social and cultural revolutions of American music, and all kind of fitting together. So the steel string guitar really emerges in the 20th century because, steel strings, they're harder to play. You really have to develop calluses on the tips of your fingers in order to play them. So you have to play every day and be very disciplined. Harder to press than nylon. Sometimes harder to get a really nice sound, especially in the higher registers, than a nylon string. Of course, nylon was a revolution as well when nylon replaced catgut for the nylon string guitars, and when so-called classical guitar kind of came to the fore again in the mid to late 20th century, a little later than you might think. But I think the main focus of his book and the main focus of the story of the guitar, I would say, is the development of the acoustic steel string as the main vehicle for the singer-songwriter. That's really, I think, the main story that's happening here, and it's the most important story of the acoustic guitar. I think to this day, most musicians, performers, amateur guitar players prefer steel string guitars to nylon string. They consider nylon string to be a little bit more esoteric. Maybe they associate it with classical guitar, which is a much harder discipline because it's not about, strumming the cowboy chords. It's going up and down the fretboard in complicated formations, playing songs that were written by, Bach and all the great guitar composers like Sohr and Tariga. That's very difficult. That's a whole another discipline. Again, kind of like, we have electric guitar. We have the whole nylon guitar phenomenon, which is its own culture. And I think most people prefer to play acoustic steel string. So that's really at the center of the story that Tim Brookes tells. Another wonderful thing about this book is that there are really two stories in the book that interweave with each other. They're interlaced throughout the whole book. So it's kind of chapter by chapter. He'll have a chapter on the history of the guitar, and those chapters are roughly chronological and thematic. And then he'll have a chapter on his own experience working with a luthier in Vermont, where he was living, to make a handcrafted guitar for him. So half the story that he tells in this book is about the building of this guitar and all the different stages it takes to actually build a guitar from scratch. So how do you acquire the tone woods? How do you choose the tone woods? Then how do you shape them? How do you craft each element of the guitar? The top, the sides, the binding, the purfling, which is these decorations on the side, on the edge of the top of the guitar, the inlays, which are these little, and here we have kind of little snowflake patterns. Often they use abalone because it's shiny and beautiful. So the inlays, the neck of the guitar, how the guitar, the fretboard, how the guitar's neck is fitted to the body, the bracing. You learn in this book. You learn a lot about techniques of bracing, to, keep the body strong and hold all that tension that the strings put on the body of the guitar. The bracing has to hold the tension, but it also has to permit the guitar to sing, to resonate when the strings are played. So there's a real art to bracing, not making it too heavy, but strong enough so that the guitar can last years and years without breaking up. The bridge, the saddle, every component to the guitar is a product of careful deliberation, very careful design, use of materials, and of course choice of different materials. So he goes through that whole process with his luthier, who emerges as a very interesting personality as well. So part of the story is the developing relationship that he has with his luthier, which I wouldn't really call it a friendship per se, but it's certainly more than just a casual, asking somebody to perform a task for you or hiring them to do a service. I think he definitely does develop a kind of personal relationship with his luthier and tells a lot of stories about him. That's a great part of the story too. So you get the history of the guitar and the emergence of the acoustic steel string guitar over, a century or more of history, with all the technical details, the social, cultural elements. And then you get the actual building of the guitar that he has ordered from the luthier. So choosing all the tone woods, the style, the look of the guitar. So I think it's really, it's two books in one. And that makes for an excellent package. You really come out with a deeper understanding of the guitar. So I always, when I go, especially when I'm going through Kindle books, I always pull out quotes that I really enjoy. And so I have a bunch of quotes that I'm just going to read from to give you a flavor and a texture of this book. Here's the first quote that I pulled out from the book, early on in the book. Because guitar stores are often owned by guitarists, they've also become places where their mates can come and hang out, thus serving as social centers and even old guitarists' homes. Most interesting of all, a guitar store is the only place in the known universe where a guy will allow himself to shop like a woman, spending half an hour or 2 hours trying a dozen guitars with only the faintest possibility of actually buying something, playing a few licks, swapping a few lies, while in the background someone plays the opening bars of Stairway to Heaven. So even though it might sound a little, disrespectful to women, I don't think that's the point of this, of his quote. It's more, he's just poking fun at people who like to shop for guitars and who will spend hours in a guitar shop just hanging out there and playing different models. I admit I'm guilty as charged. I have my favorite guitar shops in Shanghai. Unfortunately, there's not one that I know of here in Kunshan, but certainly Shanghai has its share. And I've spent many an hour. And also you get to know, often the shop owner is a luthier as well. They fix and repair guitars. And our luthier in Shanghai, Alex, who used to run Hippie's guitar shop, and now he kind of runs his own shop. He's an excellent luthier, and I've spent lots of time getting my Martin repaired. That's another story, Martins. I think everybody has a love-hate relationship with them because they're such beautiful guitars, but they're so fragile in so many ways. But then again, I've taken my Martin out and given it a good beating over time. Played in many a bar and many a cafe, many a late night, many a drop. So it's not surprising that it has cracked and frayed in many places over the years. But Alex is always there to help out. So yeah, I mean, I think the wonderful thing about this quote is that It's really about the social culture of the guitar and how it brings people together into a community, and how the guitar shop becomes a very important part of that community. And then the Stairway to Heaven. I mean, who hasn't, where is it? Wait. Yeah, it starts in A minor. Yeah, you got to kind of warm up for this one. Yeah, I'd have to play it a few times to get it smooth, but who hasn't tried out the opening bars to Stairway to Heaven in a guitar shop and then been booed by his friends? Nobody plays Stairway to Heaven in a guitar shop. That's the old joke. Here's the next quote. In a strange way, this old-time spirit survives in all kinds of communal acoustic music. When I was at college playing guitar around the dying embers of a party, nobody wanted flash. They wanted songs they knew and could sing along with if they felt like it. Cat Stevens, Simon and Garfunkel, James Taylor, Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant, everyone's repertoire in the early 70s heyday of fingerstyle acoustic guitar. It was a party, after all, not a performance. What I like about this quote is that it really rings true. It's about the guitar as a social vehicle, right? When you are playing guitar with a group of people, they're just hanging out, maybe having some drinks, partying, you don't want to flash them with some really fancy guitar work. People just want a song that they can sing along to. And when you're in a loud bar or cafe, nobody's going to hear your fancy fretwork anyway, unless you're plugged in. And usually you're not. So you're just sitting there with a guitar, and it's the resonance of the guitar itself. So, that's where the cowboy chords really come in handy. And, having a pick is also a good thing. I usually keep picks in my pocket. Oh, okay, I got a bunch there, but I also got, this is one of my favorites. It's a Martin 73 millimeter. That's a beautiful pick. I love this pick. Tortoiseshell. So if you've got, even with this orchestral model, which is not a dreadnought, not a big booming guitar, but just listen to that. I mean, just with those chords, you can sing 1,000 songs. And so I think his point is that most of the time the guitar is going to be used as a vehicle for community building, for communal singing. If you're in a college scene, or if you're in a bar, cafe where people know the songs that you're singing and playing. So I think that quote really rings true for me, and that's kind of the style of guitar that I like to play and practice anyway, because I'm, as you know from this channel, I'm more of a singer / guitar player than I am a fancy guitar player for its own sake. Not to say that I wouldn't love to learn more of those bluegrass licks and all that stuff, but mostly I'm focused on learning new songs. Here's the next quote. The debate over whether stringed instruments, such as guitars, should be played with the fingers of the right hand or with a plucking implement, like a pick, goes back 400 years or more, when a goose quill was often used as a plectrum. It has always surprised me that in contemporary America, more than anywhere else I know, a sharp division has grown up between the two parties. Flat pickers regard fingerstyle players as wusses. Fingerstyle players regard flat pickers as Neanderthals. On the whole, the Neanderthals have swept the field. Even moderately proficient fingerstyle playing is far rarer in this country than in most guitar cultures abroad. White rural music in particular has thrown in its lot with the pick. I see this a lot too when when I watch YouTube videos of guitar players and the guys who sell guitars in the shops who are always, quote unquote, reviewing the guitars that they sell. Never trust a review from a guy who's selling the guitar. I mean, that's the first rule. You need to find really independent people who have no stake in it to get the full picture, I feel. Not that those guys aren't great at what they do. I love those. I love the the acoustic shop and all these guys who sell guitars. They're fun to watch and great guitar players. But most of them use a pick. Most of them are flat pickers, so it kind of reinforces what Tim Brookes is saying here. And fingerstyle, like without a pick, it's harder to hear. Again, if you're not plugged in. But then when you plug in, I mean, pickups is a whole nother issue. Pickups are so problematic for acoustic guitars. There's so many different models and brands of them. None of them seem to work extremely well either. So you're always losing something when you plug an acoustic guitar into an amp. But yeah, let's go on. I mean, like I said, I have 1,000 thoughts about all these quotes, but I want to try to get through them. The guitars resisted the urge to trumpet their expensive woods. They were elegant rather than showy. They had the unself-conscious symmetry of trees or Bentleys. Her archtop had the clean simplicity of a classical guitar. Its F-holes were suggested rather than copied. They were like the lines around the mouth of an old woman who in her lifetime had smiled a lot. All right, I thought, but how do they play? How do they sound? How is the intonation? How was the balance between treble, mid-range, and bass? How is the action, easy or stiff? I started to play, but I'll never be able to answer those questions. It wasn't like playing a guitar. It was like being dipped in melted chocolate. I love the way he ends that. Dipped in melted chocolate. So, we kind of run out of words to express just the joy and the feeling of playing a really well-made acoustic guitar. There's something ineffable about it. Something that I would say is almost like magical. The way that it resonates in your body, just the way that it sounds, just, with a few open chord strummings. It just kind of takes your breath away. So being dipped in melted chocolate. So he's talking about a guitar made by a particular luthier named Linda. What was her last name? I'll have to look it up. But, so you learn a lot about luthiers in this book and different luthiers. Now I'm hearing fireworks. That's very typical in China. I don't know if you can hear them too. But you'll have a lot of firework blasts going off for, weddings, store openings, big ceremonies. And in addition to that, you just have constant construction work. That's why my windows are closed. Just constant construction work everywhere you go in this part of the country. Anyway, I loved the way that he describes the different, and then asks the questions about, action, which is the string height, and, the balance between the bass notes at the bottom there. They're actually at the top if you're holding the guitar this way. And then the treble notes. Is there a nice balance, or is it very bass heavy? Martins are famous for being very bass heavy and a little bit light on the treble notes, but then it depends on whether it's mahogany or rosewood. So there's all of these components that you have to think about when you think about buying a guitar, or which guitar you want to play for what purpose. And that's why serious guitar players buy multiple guitars, because there's just no one-fits-all solution for a guitar. There are many different guitars for many different styles of playing, many different modes and methods of playing and genres of music. All right, here's the next one. Oh, Linda Manzer. So now I know. Yeah, Linda Manzer is the luthier he was just talking about there. He was playing one of her guitars. I had to take all this on faith until I finally got to play a Linda Manzer archtop at a guitar festival. I'd only ever seen her work in photos or heard people talk about it in the reverent tones, usually reserved for the very old Chinese vases with dragons on them. According to report, they fingerpick very well. They flat pick very well. They take jazz like a good lawn takes croquet. That sounds like a Britishism. Players play Manzers. Collectors collect Manzers. Bruce Cockburn has 4. Pat Metheny said of one of her acoustics, "This is the best guitar I've ever played." But that was just the beginning. When you first receive her guitar, Metheny went on, a man bewitched, you will love it like you never loved anything before. But the same guitar will sound 20 times as good 10 years later than it does when it is brand new. Do you think you will be able to stand it? His latest CD, One Quiet Night, this was 20 years ago. His latest CD, One Quiet Night, consists of him noodling at home all evening on his new Manzer long scale. And that's a wonderful recording. I was inspired by this passage to listen to his album One Quiet Night, and it is just fantastic. One of the best acoustic albums I've listened to recently, and I was inspired to listen to a lot of and to learn about a lot of acoustic guitar players that I didn't know about from this book. So, you know, just kind of the worship that the best guitar players in the world have for the best guitar makers, I think, is what is coming out of that passage. Here's the next one, 1929. So he's going into the history of the guitar. A banjo player named Perry Betchell went to Martin Guitars and asked them to build him a longer-necked guitar. As a banjo player, he was used to a lot of frets. Virtually every guitar of the day had only 12 frets before the neck hit the body, and he felt cramped. The longer neck, he suggested to Frank Henry Martin, would make the guitar more versatile, more appealing to players in jazz bands who were doubling on or making the switch from banjo. Martin built him a 14-fret model, calling it the orchestral model. Jazz orchestra, that is, not classical. The 14-fret concept was so popular that it became the standard for American steel string guitars. So this guitar I have, if you look at the little dots that, you know, these dots are kind of essential when we're playing, and we just need at a glance to see what fret we're playing at. So usually they're at the 3rd fret. I don't know if you can see here, but yeah, there are the dots on the side. Good guitars should have dots on the side, as well as indications on the top of the fretboard, which are often inlays, a little fancier. But anyway, there are dots at the 3rd fret, the 5th fret, the 7th fret, the 9th fret, the 12th fret, and the 15th fret, and the 17th fret. That's very standard. So 3, 5, 7, 9, 12, because, 12 is exactly 1 octave above the original note. And also resonates at 1 octave above. And that's on the 5th fret. Anyway, so the point is, at a glance you can see what fret you're on. And traditionally guitars only went up to the 12th fret where they met the neck. So you were very limited playing beyond the 12th fret. And most people felt that they didn't need to do so. But then in 1929, Martin started making guitars that meet the neck at the 14th fret, and that has become the standard for acoustic guitars. So if you buy a 12th fret guitar that's a little unusual. Often they're known as parlor guitars. They're smaller, sometimes like 38 inches, as opposed to this, I think, is a 40-inch model, and a Dreadnought is a 41-inch model. But the parlor guitars, or the 12th fret guitars, have their own kind of special tonation and playability that's a little different from the 14th fret. I think I have one or two parlor style guitars that I both gifted to my daughters, hoping that they'll pick up the guitar, but we'll see. That's still an open question. Again, it's really hard when you're learning steel string guitar to break into it. A lot of players just stop because they just can't get into the steel strings. It takes a while to get over that hump for your fingers to become comfortable and calloused. Anyway, so you learn a lot of, just get a lot of interesting tidbits about the stages of the development of the guitar. Here's the next one. It bears repeating that the guitar rose to preeminence in the United States, partly because of physical changes in the instrument, such as what I just mentioned, partly because of developments in skill and repertoire, but largely because it became associated with popular and financially viable myths. The cowboy was invented, for the most part, long after the West was settled, which is why so many Western songs, like Southern songs, are tinted with regret and loss. He's just packed so much into this little paragraph. And I think, like all great observers of the U.S., sometimes you have to be from abroad, like de Tocqueville, right, on American democracy. You have to come from abroad to really sort of get America, to see it from a full perspective. So I just love the way that he connects the guitar to mythology, to the myth of the cowboy, which is such a core image, such a core sort of concept in guitar playing. The cowboy with the acoustic steel string guitar with a campfire, camping out somewhere in the western prairies, and he's got that guitar and he's playing some plaintive chords on it, cowboy chords. In a bar in Toledo, across from the depot, on a bar stool he took off his ring. You get it anyway. That's little Kenny Rogers. The guitar becomes such a quintessential feature of American culture and the American mythology. All right, this is a rather long one. He was a shy boy, often bullied, with a distant father and a protective mother. Among girls and women, he was comfortable but polite. The guitar alone, and yes, this is Elvis we're talking about, brought out his tenderness and caring. This is Red West, a friend from high school. The way I found out he could play the guitar, I never remember seeing him have it in school, but one of the projects we had in woodshop was to bring an article from home that needed to be repaired, and our woodshop instructor, Mr. Widdop, would look at it and evaluate what had to be done. And that would be our project for a 6-week time period. Anyway, Elvis brought a guitar. And he fooled around with it, sanded it, used some rosin glue and fixed a crack in it, stained it, varnished it. Then he took this real fine steel wool to get all the bubbles out of the lacquer and bring it down to a satin finish so it looked really good. I mean, what an extraordinary passage. This is Elvis in his formative years, basically kind of worshiping his guitar by working on it, fixing it, delicately refining it. All right, the next one. This is not a sob story. These are realities of live music. We hear so much of our music from recordings that we half forget that recorded music is little more than a postcard of live music. Live music is a human encounter with all the opportunities for human intensity, drama, conflict, and suffering. And from the musician's point of view, you only really learn about music and about your instrument and its capabilities by playing it live to an audience that will be on your side only if you convince them to be on your side. So what I love about this quote is it really resonates with me as a player and my philosophy that the core of what we do is live performance. So whether you're playing to yourself, which I think is a legitimate form of live performance, you can be your own audience. Whether you're playing to an audience of 1 or 2 or 3, or in a crowded bar to an audience of a couple dozen people, or at a concert to 100 or 200, 500 people, it's all kind of the same thing when it comes down to it. It's live music. You're doing it live. You're always at the risk of flubbing something or other. You're always going to play it in a unique way. Even if you think you're playing it the same way, there's always going to be subtleties and unique features of your playing and your singing and all the other, especially if you're playing with a band, with other people, you're going to come up with technical issues with the instruments, especially if you're plugging into amps, using pickups. You're going to have, there are going to be issues with your audience. And so it's endlessly kind of deep, profound experience to play music live. But, so much of our music consumption comes through just listening to recordings, where we're listening to the same thing that's being played the exact same way again and again and again. And even though you can appreciate different nuances of that, it's only when you listen to different performances of the same piece or the same song by the same group or the same musician that you start to catch the differences and the subtleties. It's like, that's why people are so fascinated with bootlegs, with, all the Bob Dylan bootlegs, or all the recordings of the Beatles as they were working on their songs. We want to get beyond the final product. I think if you're a serious musician or seriously interested in music, you just want to get beyond that final recording. There's something beyond that. There's other stuff to listen to that will give you deeper insights into that particular song or that particular piece. So I feel like he's really capturing that in this quote about the human intensity, drama, conflict, and suffering of live music. Having performed last night for our Rocktober festival on our campus, I can definitely sympathize with that. We were not totally on the ball with the 3 songs we chose, and it's hard to get the band together. Everybody's busy. Hard to get everybody to really get the piece down. People make mistakes. The amps aren't always good, especially in a college environment. It's kind of hit or miss. But somehow it all came together and people really loved. It seems like our audience really dug our performance and the others. And it creates a unique experience that will never be replicated again. And that's what I love about live music, just the moment. So many fine insights in here with a lot of dash and a dose of humor throughout. Here's another fairly serious one. A series of musicologists and enthusiasts searched the South to find musicians heard first on old recordings. Clarence Ashley and Doc Watson, Roscoe Holcomb, Almeida Riddle, Lightnin' Hopkins, Mississippi John Hurt, Fred McDowell, Son House, and many others black and white, and bring them to the Northeast to perform. Guitar skills fixed for years, even decades, like insects in amber, were released into the greater community, into the air. And in that community, a second generation of guitarists was listening, watching fingers, asking questions. Dave Van Ronk, John Fahey, Mike Bloomfield, the young Bonnie Raitt. I was the weird little white girl playing Robert Johnson songs. They got a big kick out of the fact that a woman was playing slide guitar in the first place, let alone an 18-year-old round-faced redhead. At the age of 20, she was hired by Buddy Guy and Junior Wells as part of their act when they opened for the Rolling Stones, and she has spent a lifetime studying the slide guitar like a monk might study the works of the Buddha. gaining the wisdom and the courage to play fewer and fewer notes. Again, there's just so much packed in there, so much densely packed insight and knowledge and history packed into that paragraph there about the transmission of guitar playing from the great blues masters from the American South, the black blues masters that we all know and love, to the great white blues masters who brought it to a global audience, which says something about popular music in general, especially in American society, and why popular music has been so powerful. It's often pioneered by black people, people of color, who again have come out of the legacy of slavery, who have their own unique stories to tell and their trials and tribulations, but are also bringing a very rich legacy from Africa, which is remembered in oral traditions and in the folk traditions and the way that music was transmitted across the generations in Black American society. And they're developing that and then sharing it with mainstream America, which was, maybe not so much today, was white America, who are then taking those idioms and those musical styles, developing them further and bringing them to the world. And that is the consistent pattern of the transmission of popular music in American society, for better or worse. But I think what he's also suggesting here is the tremendous respect that these white musicians had for the black blues masters, who taught them all the greatest skills that they had. And so using Bonnie Raitt is a great example. All right, let's move on. Whenever I go into the world, here's a quote, "Wherever I go in the world and I look for forces that are struggling against injustice," said the musician and activist Harry Belafonte, "I always seem to find somebody with a guitar and a voice, and they're always singing to something that inspires the community, no matter how ravaged that community may be." So here's Harry Belafonte, one of the great black entertainers, great singers and performers of the 20th century in America, saying, the guitar is really the vehicle for the voice of a community and the sorrows and the tribulations of that community. And so it speaks to the primacy of the guitar as it emerged in the 20th century as a vehicle for singer-songwriters. And then I decided I liked this so much that I continued. Time and again, the television showed a march or a speech or a rally, and somewhere in the middle of that mass of people would be someone with a guitar. This became a crucial symbol of small voices calling out or singing in defiance. The very smallness of the acoustic guitar, its thin, hollow vulnerability, stood for courage and a message in the face of ignorance and oppression. It was the guitar's finest hour. And if you are familiar with Chinese rock music, you will recognize this A sus2 chord as the opening chord of a very famous song, one of the most significant songs in the history of rock and roll in China, called Yi Wu Soyo, or I Have Nothing, by the great Cui Jian. So not only was the guitar used in American society, but it was used all over the world, here in China as well, as a vehicle to provide a voice to the voiceless. Here's the next one. Yet with startling suddenness, Dylan abandoned his social agenda and began to write cryptic songs of almost hallucinatory vividness with a personal rather than social thrust. This was seen as something of a betrayal, but also as a liberation. Dylan broadened the emotional palette of the popular song to the point where, for the singer-songwriter-guitarist, anything was fair game. As Nancy Griffith has written, he's great at writing bitter songs, and that fundamentally is what I realized when I first heard Dylan, that you can express anything in songs. So, this just speaks to my interest, my particular interest in Bob Dylan as the seminal songwriter of the late 20th century, who, as we all know, is primarily a guitar player, although he plays piano as well. Using the guitar as a vehicle at first as a solo artist, and then later when he went electric with a whole blues band backing him to sing some of the most significant songs in the history of popular music. So that was a particular moment in time in the 1960s when this great artist emerged out of everything that was brewing in the history of the guitar, which is all pretty well explained and contextualized in the book. In so doing, Dylan also created the beginnings of a new repertoire and vocabulary for college-educated guitarists. 5 years previously, college kids were listening to the poppy acoustic folk of the Kingston Trio. Dylan was writing material that was caustic, superior, and contemporary. A new class was emerging, the intelligent and aware young middle class, and Dylan was the first person to write its curriculum. Dylan gave them a voice, or a series of voices, that no student body in America had had. In doing so, he helped redefine the acoustic guitar as a modern instrument, as a thinking person's instrument, and as a middle-class instrument. He also, in Nashville Skyline, drew white middle-class attention to country music, flying in the face of decades of prejudice and inviting a reconnection between two divergent streams of guitar history. So that's another just fantastic synthesis of the importance of Bob Dylan as a seminal figure in popular music, but also in the history of the guitar. Making people take the guitar more seriously as an instrument for songwriting, but also started to fuse. I mean, it wasn't just country music. He brought in the blues. Many of his songs are blues-based. He was very steeped in the blues. He also brought in folk music. So he had all these different traditions that he was fusing together into his repertoire, which is why he's such an amazing and unique individual in the history of songwriting and in the history of the guitar. Moving on. The 70s were a dangerous time for electric guitarists, in fact. John Rostill of the Shadows was electrocuted in 1973 while playing his bass in his basement studio, and Keith Relf, formerly of the Yardbirds, reportedly died while plugging in his electric guitar in 1976. In the same year, Kiss guitarist Ace Frehley was nearly electrocuted during a concert in Florida when he touched a short-circuited light, but after being carried off stage, he returned 10 minutes later to finish the show. Not very impressive, frankly, but that's hardly his fault. By using 220 to 240 volts, the UK has a built-in advantage in the electrocution business. I just chose this because it had so happened that Ace Frehley had just passed away when I was reading this, and it just kind of, that passage struck a chord with me. But he rarely talks about the electric guitar in this book. It's mostly about acoustic guitar. So it's almost as if he's showing a kind of disdain for the electric guitar in this passage. And again, I feel like acoustic guitar and electric guitar are such different cultures to emerge in the 20th century. They just took the guitar into different directions. And if you're an electric guitar player, you are obsessed with a whole range of different things. than you are if you're an acoustic guitar player. Here's a pithy one. An old guitar that costs more than my house, and all this fetishism of model years and numbers, of the cosmetics of appearance, this sudden fascination with America's least favorite subject, history. How did this happen? So he's kind of poking fun at like the arrival in the late 20th century of the concept of the vintage guitar, and how you could start to sell guitars at these incredible prices, literally the cost of a house or a car. There's a great documentary that I just watched recently, Norm's Guitar Shop, about the guy who runs a vintage guitar shop in LA that's frequented by movie stars, rock stars, where he offers hundreds of vintage guitars, electric and acoustic. I think one of his biggest customers is Joe Bonamassa, who has apparently 400 guitars in his own private collection. So again, when I say I have a dozen guitars, it's really not that big a deal. Okay, it really isn't. And when you think of a dozen guitars, if you have 4 nylons, 4 steel string acoustic, and 4 electric, that's a pretty nice, well-rounded collection. I just happen to have a lot more acoustic steel strings just because that's my favorite kind of guitar, and that's mostly what I play. But I do keep a nylon string guitar around in both my homes here in Shanghai, just because I do like playing on the nylon string, and there's something to be said about just playing around with the nylon string when you're watching TV or you're just kind of sitting there. There's a beauty to the nylon string that I think is missing in the acoustic steel string, and vice versa. Anyway, we're almost done here. Got a few more left, but I do want to get through all these quotes, and we're already at 45 minutes. I know these videos run long, but think of it more as a podcast. Grun didn't start out to be a dealer. He started out as an addict. I was going to college at the University of Chicago, and my parents were footing the bill. Every month they gave me money up front for room, board, and books. They also had agreed that they would buy me 1 guitar, and in 1963 I bought my first guitar. One thing led to another. My 4th guitar, a few months later, was a 1924 Gibson L5, signed and dated by Lloyd Loar. Cost $400 at Sid Sherman Music on Wabash in Chicago. $400 was tough for me to come up with. I basically had to eat canned beans for 4 months, but I was able to put a deposit down and pay it off over time. Collecting something is very much an addiction. I started out with a guitar every 90 days habit, then it became a guitar a month habit, then a guitar every couple of weeks habit, then a guitar a week. And by the time I was living in Nashville, before I had a store, if I hadn't bought, sold, or traded a guitar that day, I was going to have withdrawal symptoms. So this really speaks to the addiction of guitar collection, and how a collector, starts out with this obsession, and then eventually some collectors choose to become dealers, and they'll open up a shop, and that kind of makes sense. Like if you start collecting a lot of guitars, maybe you've tried one and you like it, or you play it less. You decide you're going to trade up for something else. I see a lot of guys on the used market here in China that are offering several guitars up on the used market, and some of them are saying, yeah, I want to trade up to another guitar, so I'm selling this one. So people buy and sell guitars for all sorts of reasons, and I suppose some people develop some kind of equilibrium where they have just a collection, but they're constantly switching them in and out of their collection, buying them and selling them. And then if you get savvy enough at that, and it becomes kind of your life, then you decide that you're just going to make that your profession, your career, like that guy Norm. Can't remember his last name at the moment, but have to look it up. Norm's Guitar Shop in LA, and this guy Grun, kind of similar story that Tim Brookes is talking about here. So he's talking about guitar addiction, but also how that leads to other stages, and it fuels the whole vintage guitar industry. All right, next quote. Finally, are really good instruments either important or necessary? Paul McCartney has said, "I never had a really good instrument, but it didn't matter. The whole thing with the Beatles was we never really had great instruments. We never really had great headphones. We never really had great microphones or PAs. We somehow learned to muddle through. In fact, I think that was quite good for us. We always made do with whatever we had." And I've heard this before. I'm not sure if I totally agree with it, but in a sense, it does resonate. That if you take away the Beatles singing from their recordings and you just play the recorded music without their singing, it just doesn't really sound that great. I think Pete Townsend pointed that out. And he's probably right. I mean, they weren't playing with the greatest instruments. That recording techniques back then weren't that well developed. What made the Beatles so special and unique was their voices. That their voices by far were their greatest instruments. And when they sang together in harmony, there was nothing in the world that could compete with that sound, right? And you could counter argue, yeah, but Paul McCartney was a great bass player. Yes, of course. And they all played their instruments well, and George Harrison was a fantastic lead guitar. But when you hear the quality of the sound, there is something to that. It's just not quite up there. I'm sure they would have done much better if they had, if they had been recording in our times, in contemporary times, with the best instruments, with the best recording techniques. It would sound better. I sometimes listen to Beatles songs, and it may be a little bit heretical to say this as a great Beatles fan that I am. But yeah, they do. The sound quality of their recording sounds really dated in some cases. You have to kind of get beyond that. But again, it's their voices, I think, that really made them as a band. And of course, their songwriting, the songwriting itself, the lyrics, the melodies, the chords. That's what made the Beatles so brilliant. Anyway, next one. Another quote. "Once restored, I found this guitar to be the best sounding Baroque guitar I had ever played," Brunet said. Another argument for it being a good enough instrument for royalty. Unfortunately, Brunet lost contact with the owner, who by then was not only elderly but unwell. He no longer knows who owns Marie Antoinette's guitar, where it is, or even if it is still in one piece. This guitar is living testimony that a well-made guitar is literally a light bulb that doesn't burn out, as it has had a useful musical life of nearly 350 years so far, he said. "I only hope it is being kept in proper humidity-controlled conditions." So the wonderful thing about this guitar is that all of a sudden it pops out. He's talking about Marie Antoinette's guitar, and that it's still maybe somewhere in the world and still being played. That's amazing. So can you imagine what the price on the market of a guitar that had been played by the fingers of Marie Antoinette? That would be amazing. Next quote. "The guitar evolved as one of the most intimate of instruments. Without technical assistance, it can be heard by perhaps a couple of hundred very quiet people or a dozen rowdy ones. But the size of its ideal audience is one. This is why it's the instrument of introverts and seducers." I just love that. He just has to get that last little witty word in at the end of his thought, right? Introverts and seducers. I'm certainly an introverted person. That's why I'm sitting here in my room talking to you through a camera. I just love spending time alone with my guitars, strumming them, playing them, sometimes in the key of E, sometimes in the key of G, probably the most common chord to start out a song in guitar. And the guitar really lends itself to being played in the key of G, just the way, if you're playing in standard tuning, that is. The other great chord to start a song with is D, because then you can go down to C and then G with without barely moving your fingers. So I think a lot of songs just started with guitar players being lazy, sitting in a room by themselves and like... Skies are so blue, sweet home Alabama. Lord, I'm coming home to you. Ooh, ooh, ooh. God, every time I play that song, I want to go to Alabama. It just makes me want to go to Alabama so much. Anyway, you get my point. All right, next quote. Tradition at Sal says that at the dawn of the 14th century, one Erasmo was employed in the chief industry of the town, the making of saddles. As this man was drying some sheep intestines in order to make his thread, some were carried away by the wind and became lodged in a thorn bush. Erasmo noticed that sweet musical sounds were emitted as the material was vibrated by the wind blowing through the bush. Being an observant man and an ingenious one, the thought came to him that the threads used in sewing saddles might also be used as strings in the primitive instruments that were ancestors of the violin. Thus the beginning of making violin strings from catgut began. And so important did the industry become to the small town that eventually Erasmo was sainted. And Saint Erasmo is not only the patron saint of the town, but also of the profession of string making. So here he's just going deep into the history of the guitar and talking about strings. I just love that story and how nature inspired the original string maker who was making saddles. So it connects saddles for the horseback, to the guitar. And you can imagine like guys going around on horseback with a guitar slung on their back, right? The guitar was the perfect instrument for horseback riders, for travelers. And that's why it's become such a powerful instrument worldwide. Like me, why did I pick up guitar? When I was, I learned it a little bit when I was a kid. I wish I had studied it a lot more intensively. I'd be a much better player. But I took piano instead, and I'm happy with that. But anyway, I didn't really pick it up again until I was like 22 years old. In graduate school, I was about to go off on a trip to Asia. And I decided, well, it might be hard to find a piano. I want to continue to play music, so I'm going to pick up a guitar instead. So I got a guitar, I got a teacher to teach me some basics. That's another story for another episode. But the point is, guitar is the perfect instrument for the traveler. Anyway, we're coming to the end. Just a couple more, I think. The Irish Pavilion reminded him of his early days in New York and the people he had met there, artists like John Lee Hooker, Cisco Houston, and Big Joe Williams. These men were monumental in his mind. They had informed and influenced his entire career. Oh, now I'm on another book, a book about Bob Dylan called Down the Highway, The Life of Bob Dylan. So I have reached the end of The Guitar by Tim Brookes. And so I'm going to sign off for now. So thank you for listening. If you have been listening this far, that's pretty amazing since this has gone well over an hour. But I am a professor. I like to talk a lot. So, if you put my YouTube channel on as a podcast and listen to it while you're driving, that could work. You're probably not going to want to just sit there watching me for an hour or more. But if you're just casually listening while you're doing something else, then this could work as a podcast. We'll see. Would love to get your comments and feedback and suggestions. I am not going to edit this down. That would just take way too much time. So it is what it is. See you all next time.